Well, Jeff, thanks so much for joining. It's great to talk to you. Where are you right now?
I am out on Long Island. Been out here for 3+ months, a little back and forth to the city, but it's nice to be out here with a lot of open space and relatively peace and calm in the middle of what's been a very chaotic couple of months.
Yeah,
So it's good. There's some good things, right? You get to see your kids and spend some more time and have dinner and do all that. So fortunate to be able to do that.
that's great. And I'm sure this has been probably like three of the most tumultuous, high volatility months you could have ever imagined at a real estate company on so many levels.
Yeah, let's just say on March, whatever it was, 10th, I didn't expect this to be the next couple of months coming up. I mean, it really is thrown a grenade in the middle of what had been a great year, a great couple of years, and a significant growth path for us. So it's had its challenges.
And I'm curious to just get your perspective. Obviously, Related is, I'd say one of the most ambitious, one of the most pioneering developers of real estate. So you clearly have a view, a perspective on cities and how they're changing. And what you did in Hudson Yards is obviously so impressive and so grand. I guess at a macro level, how do you think, and this is maybe such a wide question, but I'm curious to get your view on
Yeah.
it. How do you think cities, like a city like New York in 2025, how is it different at a fundamental level than how it was in 2020, if at all?
Right. I mean, I would say, there's a couple things happening. People like to, in the midst of whatever the situation is, like to think that the worst is going to be the new base case. And, I don't really think that's true. So today we hear, the death of the office building. No one's ever going to work in an office again. Everyone's going to work from home. You get, a whole bunch of corporate leaders saying half my company is going to work from home. And then kind of that goes down its own path. And then you get, why would I ever want to work in a city ever again? The suburbs are coming back. You're sitting in Utah, you might as well just stay there, because that's kind of the moment. And I think, if you think back, my career, I had, I guess, four major shocks, right? So, 90, 9/11, 08, and now, and I guess there were a couple others in the middle, smaller ones. And each time you get that same sense of foreboding, like this, we're in the midst of this. And I think it's important when you're kind of things are bad, my partner, Steve Ross, always likes to say, when things are bad, you can't see how things are ever going to turn good. And when things are good, you can't see how they're ever going to turn bad. And, you kind of, I lean on that statement quite a bit in the midst of this. And so I think if you think forward, you pick 2025, I think you have to break it into segments, right? I think the cities are going to struggle for the next 2 years, right? Or the line in the sand is really this vaccine, right? That we all hope is being created. And it's not just the day that they say it's created. People have to actually manufacture it, and then people have to take it, right? So I don't know how long that takes, but let's say that whole period is 2 years. I think for the next 2 years, we're going to be in this like middle ground, where people continue to do the Zoom stuff that we're doing, and half dip their toe in back to the cities, half living out of the city. The masks and all the precautions obviously don't make for a great work environment. But I think once we get to the other side of that, I think office buildings fully recover. I actually think, and we've seen it from our tenants, that are actually now need to de-densify their space. There was this trend, obviously, for very tight seating, bench seating, trading floors, people, within inches of each other, and people just can't do that right now. So I think in the office space, I think you're going to see actually differentiation between the Class A buildings and the Class B buildings. The Class A buildings with really the credit tenants that can afford to take more space and do the right thing for their employees. and also those same buildings that have typically large lobbies, lots of elevator capacity, big capacity, new HVAC systems, and probably well capitalized to make sure that, you know, thermal scanners or whatever the PPE that is that we need is available for everybody. And then you have these Class B buildings that typically have, you know, less credit tenants, small lobbies, small elevators, bad HVAC, and I think those buildings are going to suffer. So people say, you know, what's the office market going to be like? I don't think there's a clear answer. I think you got to study, you know, one-off individually. And then I think cities, I mean, there has been a trend towards cities for, you know, 20 plus years, more than that, right, for decades now, that people have moved back from the suburbs into urban centers. And why? Because people like to be together. People like the activity of the city. People like culture and arts and bars and restaurants. And, you know, I don't think that's going away. The struggle is, you know, will the bars and the restaurants and the culture be there when it is actually safe to go there again? And I think that's the scariest part for me. You know, I know in our retail centers, you know, we've taken a split view on how to interact with our tenants. We've got large credit tenants that, you know, have taken the position they don't want to pay rent because they don't want to pay rent, because they could hire the best lawyers to go fight. And we have taken a very hard line in response to that. And on the other end of the spectrum, you know, we have small shops and restaurants where I am, you know, very sympathetic to the situation. They really can't pay rent. Even more than that, at the moment they can't. Even when they open, I know at 50% occupancy, they probably can't even make money pre-rent. And so, you know, I think it's, you know, every landlord's responsibility to try and kind of make those tenants survive, to help those tenants survive, because that's the part that makes our city special.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we're doing whatever we can to do that. But ultimately, I think people come back. I think this working from home has been functional. It works. We can operate our business, but it's not productive. Creativity doesn't happen. Innovation doesn't happen. You don't see body movements and, you know, what people are thinking by the way they react. You don't get that brainstorming in the hallway. And so I think we opened up some of our offices already in some cities, and you know, talking to our people that are back, they're like, oh, it's like breath of fresh air.
Right.
You know, kids aren't running around. The dog's not in the background. I saw yours running by. And you know, I do think people want to get back, but it's going to be a struggle for you know, a window of time. And but you know, I'd say I'm pretty optimistic.
And Related's obviously been one of the most forward-thinking, and I would say kind of partner-oriented landlords as it relates in particular to retail tenants. Like what you've done in building these relationships with these, you know, smaller, fast-growing new food concepts, new apparel concepts, and attracting them to your assets and building not only a landlord-tenant relationship, but kind of, you know, building greater intimacy with almost an investment, like an equity partner type relationship. Has that relationship borne fruit? I mean, this is almost exactly why you have that relationship, right? Is so it's not purely transactional. There's a alignment.
I mean, all right. I mean, you know, I'd say, you know, we did that because we didn't, you know, our centers are in, you know, urban areas, right? Urban high-rise vertical retail. And what these cities are all different and special and unique. And what we didn't want to do was create a suburban mall in New York City or in whatever city that we were building. And so, you know, we said to ourselves, well, how do we make this genuine? How do we make it unique? And the only way to do that, we thought, was to have retail that wasn't available in the Short Hills Mall, right? It had to be something different. And so, you know, restaurants are clearly a big part of that equation. And so we invested in restaurants, great restaurants, to make that happen. But we also thought that retail was changing. And if we just went to get into the traditional retailers, you know, that would, again, get back to the mall concept that we were trying to avoid. And so we thought the retailers that are going to survive are those that have changed their business model, right? I don't think retail is going away. I think bad retail is going away. And this is just an acceleration of all that, right? Everything that you and I have been talking about for a while now, right? And so the idea was to back smart retailers, and many of these were digitally native, first, right? They started online and then decided to go physical, and they had a lot of the things. I almost think it's easier to do that than have physical stores that try to create, omni-channel presence. And so we backed a lot of these smaller e-commerce retailers that, interestingly, managed to stay in business throughout this and continue operating. The stores became their drag, which was not meant to be the intent. But I think that's what makes our retail special. It's got local retailers, it's got these interesting e-commerce startups, and it has restaurants. And of course we had to sprinkle in some of the larger credit tenants because they help pay the bills. But we've been working with all the kind of partner retailers, as you call it, to help them get through this.
And one of the things that, I was fortunate enough to stay at the Equinox Hotel at Hudson Yards. And I think what's so interesting about Hudson Yards is it's kind of like a city within a city, right? It has everything, right? You have multifamily, you have retail, you have restaurants, you have fitness, you have event centers, you have art installations. It's such a kind of eclectic combination of assets that I think work together. You really feel like you're in a micro city. And I'm curious, just, this crisis in some ways has changed how landlords think about themselves as almost like micro mayors of having this responsibility for, their slice of the world. Do you think about Related as kind of increasingly having that view in terms of like the safety of everyone in your micro city is your responsibility, and you almost have greater control over it than the city does at some level? And in some ways that's a real positive. In some cases that also puts more responsibility on landlords.
I'm glad that you had those observations, because that's really what we tried to create when we thought about Hudson Yards. This didn't happen by accident. There was a lot of planning and thinking as to it was curated in a way, right? And the idea was truly to create within a city, a live, work, play neighborhood. And that's kind of cliche to say, but if you think about Hudson Yards,
that's what it is.
That's what it is. We always, we use kind of a day in the life, right? A day in the life at Hudson Yards, right? You can work there, you can live there, you go to Equinox, you can stay at the hotel, you go to the restaurants, you go shopping, go to the spa, whatever it is, and you never have to leave. Backup resiliency for power and energy and kind of all these things, environmental sustainability that, we thought about because we wanted to be prepared and in a way that create the city of the future. Now, I won't take credit that we definitely didn't plan on a pandemic and preparing for that, but we did plan for a lot of things. And as a result, the resiliency, that close-in nature of living and working, by each other, I think actually played really well through this pandemic, because the whole issue, one of the many issues of it going back to work right now, is public transportation and being out. Here, everything is at your fingertips, and I think people will come to appreciate that even more so now. And as I said earlier, the Class A buildings, and we have taken a huge customer-centric approach to bringing our tenants back in terms of all the doing all the proper things and being ahead of the curve. And people that are living nearby or at Hudson Yards can continue going to work without the struggle that is being that comes with going back into the urban centers right now.
Yeah, and that's something we've talked about a lot. Just this dynamic between thinking about retailers. So many young emerging retailers, their first response when they want to open a store is, I want to be on Avakinney, or I want to be in Soho. And then they have to take this shell space from a landlord that doesn't own the building next to it and doesn't control the street environment. Right. But there's something that's really powerful in that curation, because you Related have this almost kind of command and control relationship where you can curate, you can kind of make decisions at a macro level. And I'm curious, in that responsibility, how are you thinking about technology, right? This pandemic has in some ways been like a wake-up call for a lot of people. And one of the most obvious touch points is access control. Like, how do you control who gets into and out of assets, and what criteria do you use? Has it changed some of your thinking around that? Obviously, like temperature screening is the obvious.
Right. I mean, we again, as you know, I mean, we tried to be on the forefront of technology, but it changes so fast. The forefront is old by the time you install it many times. But, at the buildings, we do run the buildings from, a high tech approach in terms of building management systems and, doing that to create efficiency in our energy consumption. But we also created a system we call PASS, which allows for this frictionless access into the office building. So, if you and I have a meeting on Outlook, and we talked about this once before, that you'll get an email early in the morning confirming your meeting at whatever building at Hudson Yards, give you directions how to get there. When you come into the building, it's going to register that you're there. It'll send you a QR code, and you would just swipe without touching turnstiles. You'll immediately get a readout and a message sent to a destination dispatch elevator. So you, again, getting to the elevator, not touching anything,
Right.
going up. And when you get into the building, it will send an email to people upstairs, telling whoever you're meeting with and an assistant, telling them you're there. And then depending on what they say, it might tell you to go to a certain conference room. So all that without having to go to the, typical surly security guard that asks for your ID and you can write down Joe, Schmo, and sign in.
Right.
Which is kind of useless security in and of itself. And so we've tried to incorporate a lot of that technology, and now certainly the hand scans for our tenants to get through the turnstiles, and you're able to call the elevator from your iPhone, have all become very handy and useful. And so yeah, I think technology has been helpful, and you'll see more of these kind of building systems, become technologically advanced over
Yeah.
time.
And I think it obviously favors newer assets, right? This opportunity to like, build a micro city that you do really control. And I know that sustainability obviously has been very important to Related and what you've done at Hudson Yards. And I'm just curious, I had a conversation with a Harvard professor who focuses on kind of industrial hygiene, and which is now obviously a very important topic. Have you seen more questions from tenants about air quality? And the reason I ask it is that I just signed a lease for Fifth Wall 6 months ago, and it
Right.
never even occurred to me that I should be asking about air quality. For sure, if I'm signing a lease in 2020 or 2021, I'm asking about it. Have you seen that from tenants?
Absolutely. We have, again, this goes back to the have and the have nots on these office buildings. So I mean, we already had kind of the most advanced HVAC systems with clean, fresh air intake that exceeded kind of any industry standard. And actually, it's very easy for us to dial that up, which we did right now. Now, interesting, there's a trade-off between fresh air intake and energy efficiency, because the more fresh air you bring into the building, it either has to be heated or cooled, depending on the season, which uses more energy. Today, we have moved to more fresh air, and we'll moderate that as necessary. So yeah, I think those things do make a difference. Tenants are looking to see what you're doing. Like, we're studying UV light right now, and there are different types of UV that are not dangerous to humans, and so we're considering replacing elevator lighting with UV lighting, because elevators are a bottleneck spot where people have to come into somewhat close proximity. So yeah, we constantly are challenging our teams to find kind of new technologies and how the buildings can operate more efficiently.
And what are some of the, I'm just curious, like, what are some of the kind of counterintuitive questions you're getting from tenants now? Like, I think air quality comes up as an obvious one, but what are tenants asking about today that they weren't asking about 6 months ago?
I mean, I think the biggest, question we see from both sides, and I'm not sure, how it plays out, but is kind of what we said about, you hear a lot of business leaders now talking about, working from home and decreasing office staff, and having people work remotely on a more permanent basis, which then, you have all the analysts say the death of the office building. And so we are actually hearing both, right? So to hear from large tenants that they have to take more space immediately because they they can't possibly have their employees come back to such dense space. And at the same time, it could be an hour later from a different tenant saying, I got to give back some space because, I don't need it. I can't afford it. My employees are going to work from home in the same day. Right. So it's interesting. And, I don't know at the end of the day, which one outweighs the other. If you had a very strong view on it, you could buy some of the office REITs at a pretty big discount right now.
Right.
But I think it's playing out in both directions.
And one of the things I had a conversation with the CEO of Jacina, the largest office owner in France. And one of the interesting topics that came up is, why do we have a 5-day work week, right? Like, if you look at a lot of your assets, I mean, you're accommodating knowledge workers, right? These aren't manual, there's not a lot of manual labor happening inside your assets. And the 5-day work week is in some ways a relic of an age that has long passed us, and yet everyone sticks to it. And in some ways, the bottlenecks and the logistical problems that come from that are unnecessary. Like, why does everyone arrive to a building at between 7 and 9 a.m. on Monday through Friday and leave between 5 and 7 p.m.? And a lot of those teams don't need to work together. I guess a long way of leading into, do you think we're moving away from a 5-day work week, regardless of how office changes? Do you think we're entering a world where it's a 24/7 work week, but there's these kind of, there's a continuum of when people are free and not free? Or do you think that's too far out there?
I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like we've already been at that place of 24/7. But
right.
I do think there's some semblance of order, by having, weekdays and weekends, and schools operate that way. And I think that might just be a cultural change too far.
Right.
But I do agree with you on the staggered starts, and that will definitely happen. Everybody's talking about that, and primarily to ease congestion on public transportation.
Yeah.
And so I think we'll see some companies or groups within companies starting, at 6 a.m. and working till whatever, 3, 4, 5, and then some people in that normal band, and or it could be 10 to 8, or whatever it is. People are definitely talking about that, and we're actually, as a landlord, helping our tenants coordinate so that if someone wants to pick 7 to 5, that we have the next tenant aware of that there'll be that influx of people coming in, and hopefully they'll pick an hour later or whatever it is. So I do think we're taking on unusual roles as landlord, in terms
more
of
consultative role with tenants,
with our tenants, right? And coordinated, which we typically don't do. And then, as I'm sure you're doing in your office, everybody's going through, and we're doing it for ourselves, kind of the return to office protocols, right? And we've actually been working with Mount Sinai Health Systems to help us make sure we had kind of the latest and greatest standards to do that. And then, our tenants are reaching out to us and saying, can you help me? What am I, they don't know, someone in the cosmetics industry doesn't really have the resources to do this. So we've been helping our tenants kind of create these return to office protocols. Again, kind of more involved in their space than we typically would be. But again, I think that's going to further differentiate the buildings and the landlords that can really
that can do that have
do
that,
more
yeah.
do more in this time than others.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the macro theme we keep bumping up against, which is the landlords that have really thought about curation in your words, but also just like master planning and thinking about their tenants as citizens.
Right. Our tenants are our partners. I think this contractual relationship is you got to break that down.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. Well, Jeff, this has been fantastic, and thank you so much for your insights. I'm sure you're juggling a lot. Thanks for chatting.
Lots of fun. Good to see you. Hopefully I can see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, I hope so too.
All right.
Look forward to it.
Hang in there.